And I struggled for a number of years learning to be a newspaper reporter, learning to write traditional, conventional news stories. I struggled with how to make that leap to someone who could write more creatively. And I gradually did it, in large part because later, a few years down the line, the Philadelphia Inquirer hired me. That was easily, to this day, the most significant professional event in my life, because that newspaper in the 70s and the 80s was more devoted to creative writing and journalism than any publication that I know of in the country. And you were given an opportunity, I was, to really grow as both a reporter and a writer. But it was a lot of hard slogging before then. And the problem wasn't just trying to convince editors of what I wanted to do. What I discovered was that as much as they disdained the notion of the journalist as artist, they actually loved great stories. And I learned this really for the first time, and at least one instance that was really memorable to me, when I was invited one day to go along on a drug raid with the Anne Arundel County Police. I was covering at that time Anne Arundel County and just grinding out typical suburban coverage. But every morning I would drive down from my home in Baltimore to Annapolis, and I would stop at Millersville, Maryland, which was where the Anne Arundel County Police headquarters was. And what was great is that they would have police reports from all over the county assembled. And the captain who was responsible for dealing with the press, his name was Captain Lindsay, took a liking to me because I showed up every morning, and I was the only reporter who did. And I would come into his office, he'd have a cup of coffee waiting for me, and he'd have a stack of these police reports. And what I learned about the police department is they're a tremendous reporting mechanism, because they're basically cruising all around the county looking for trouble all night. And whenever they find it, they would write up a little report. And for me, this was the raw material then, where I could go out sometimes, pick up a story in the morning and chase it during the day and come up with my own story for the end of the day. Well, I think Captain Lindsay admired my industry, and so at one point he asked me if I wanted to go along on a drug raid. He said, we're going to hit all of the major drug dealers in Anne Arundel County. So I said, absolutely, sign me up. So I showed up at 3 o'clock in the morning on the appointed day as the drug squad was assembling for these raids. And they're out in the parking lot of the police headquarters drinking beer, partying basically, stumbling off into the bushes to take a leak. It was like a party atmosphere. And then they all get in their cars and they drive out to the housing projects just outside of Annapolis, which strikes me as curious because, why are the most successful drug dealers in Anne Arundel County living in the housing projects, right? And so they round up, spent hours banging down doors, rounding people up, pulling them out of their bedrooms, herding them out into yards in their underwear, and seizing the drugs, in their apartments. At the end of all this foolishness, they held a press conference in Annapolis where they invited all of the press corps from Washington, Annapolis, and Baltimore, TV, radio, everybody. I was the only reporter who had been with them, all night. So Captain Lindsay had done me a huge favor. And they laid out on a couple of tables all of the drugs that they had seized. And they announced at this press conference that they had seized an estimated $800,000 worth of drugs in these raids and rounded up all the major drug dealers in Anne Arundel County. Well, now, I was about 22 years old. I had just graduated from college. Needless to say, I had more experience with drugs than anyone in that room. Certainly recreational drugs, right? And what I'm looking at on that table are the petty stashes of about 20 people that they've grabbed out of their sock drawers, This is not a, major drug bust. But of course, the middle-aged crowd, this is back now in the mid-1970s, the sort of middle-aged reporters who have no experience with this, they're just eating this stuff up. So I had a real dilemma. I knew that the big story that was going to be on TV and radio and on the front page of the Baltimore Sun and the Washington Post, was going to be Anne Arundel County Police, busted a, drug ring in their county last night and seized an estimated $800,000 worth of drugs. So what am I going to write? If I write in the traditional style, and again, I go back to this notion of news stories in their traditional way of being written are very abstract. You have to make judgments, value judgments, as a reporter and a writer when you write that story. So either I write the story that they've peddled to everybody in the room, or I write Anne Arundel County Police have perpetrated an enormous fraud on the public, putting out, the petty drug stashes of the people from the housing projects and claiming, on whose authority am I going to write this, my own? Well, you know what? Today I probably would, but at 22 I lacked the gumption to do that. So I didn't know quite what to do, and I fell back on my friends, the new journalists. And so I wrote a story that began with a bunch of cops in a parking lot outside of police headquarters drinking beer and stumbling off into the bushes and taking a leak. I wrote about the housing projects and the people that are hurting out of their houses. And I wrote about, the appearance of the drugs that they had on the table. And then I reported accurately what they claimed about all this. Needless to say, it was a huge hit, this story, because it read like a story. It had scenes, action, characters, and it arrived at a wholly different place than what the police had intended. My editors loved it. It was really the first story I ever wrote that I think that the paper got really excited about. This despite their disdain for, the journalist as artiste. It turns out they actually liked stories written in this way. Needless to say, I was not Captain Lindsay's favorite reporter after this. And I never got invited out on a drug raid again. But after that, it sort of pointed the way for me. To me, I really think that the kind of reporting that I initially admired and the kind that I try to practice today is in its own way a lot more truthful and a lot more important than the more conventional reporting could be. In large part, it's because I'm very fortunate now that I get a lot of time to work on stories. I can really develop them. I can chase down every avenue that I want to chase down. I can write at length, and I've given a great deal of freedom, probably too much freedom, to write. I mean, in the old days, I could barely write a sentence that wouldn't be edited to death. Now I'm lucky if I get anybody to give it a close read. Young editors are intimidated and they won't edit my stories. And I benefit, as anyone does, from careful editing. So, for me, I'm lucky to do what I do, both because I was obsessed at a very young age with doing one thing in particular, and I was lucky enough to get the opportunity to do that at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and then there's been a few other lucky breaks along the way.